Good morning, students. In today's lecture, we'll be discussing another source of law, that is legislation. In our previous lectures, we have discussed custom as a source of law. In today's lecture, we'll be discussing legislation as a source of law. To start with the topic, I would like to put down the pointers that we would be looking into in our lectures. In today's lecture, we shall focus on definition, concept of legislation, from where does the legislation derives their validity, what is the purpose, importance, and demerits. In later lectures, we'll be discussing the kinds of legislation, wherein we will see the detail what we understand by delegated legislation, what are the differences between different sources of law. To start with, when we talk about legislation, legislation is a term which has been defined differently by different scholars. As per Salmond, legislation is that source of law which consists in the declaration of rules by a competent authority. Gray defines legislation as a formal utterance of the legislative organs. Austin says that there can be no law without a legislative act. When we have discussed analytical school of jurisprudence, we have seen that Austin has given predominant importance to the legislation, to the laws made by the superior authorities. Here, Austin believes that all the laws that have been laid down to regulate a legal system, they are typical laws and they are in the form of statutes and legislation, and they have to go through a normal process of lawmaking. Thus, the emphasis of analytical school of jurisprudence has been always on the importance of legislation as an important source of law. When we talk about legislation, it is believed that among all the sources of law, legislation is the most important, patent, and sovereign source of lawmaking. This is because legislation has all the power of enacting laws as well as repealing the old laws. The term legislation is a term which has been derived from a Latin term, and it includes two words, two Latin terms, leges, that means law, and latum, which means to make, to put, or to set. Thus, when we say that what does the term legislation means, it means that we are laying down laws, or we are setting down laws, we are putting down laws. Is that process, legislation is that process that makes the law. Thus, legislation means making of law. In literal terms, it may be defined as the promulgation of legal rules by an authority which has the power to do so. Such authorities which has power to do so are defined as legislatures. To say legislation or statutory law is a law or the process of making a law. These laws are enacted by legislature. Legislature is that body or chamber of people who make, amend, or repeal. Thus, we say that there are basically three features. It is a process of making law, and such laws are enacted by legislature. And the legislature is what? It is the body or a chamber of people who are making, amending, or repealing the existing laws. When we talk about legislation, we cannot skip talking about bill. Now, it is a document which is framed before a legislation is formally enacted by the legislature. And it comes before, that is to say that it comes before a formal law is laid down by the legislature, wherein a proper procedure is followed. To say a bill, when passed by both the houses of parliament and signed by the president, it becomes the law of the land. It is enacted as a law. Legislations are enacted keeping in mind the objects of welfare state. To say, when we talk about legislation, a legislation is laid down keeping in mind as to what are the needs of people, how law can serve best to the interest of the people or the member of the society. To say, they are framed keeping in mind the existing needs of the society. And this is why the laws, the legislations keep on changing, amending, repealing if the need arises. When we talk about legislation, we cannot skip talking about Article 13(3)(b) of the Constitution. Now, this is the article from where the legislation has derived their validity, and it clearly states that law includes the laws that are made by the state. Now, state is a term which is defined under Article 12 of the Constitution, and both the articles have been discussed previously in the class. I would like my students to go through the previous lectures and also through Article 13 and 12 of the Act, as Article 13 says that what can be considered as law, and any law which is in force should not violate Part 3 of the Constitution in order to be a valid law. Now, next we need to understand that what is the purpose of legislation. When we talk about legislation, there are various purposes for which a legislation is laid down. Few has been enumerated by me for your convenience. Like, for example, it is to regulate, to authorize, to prescribe, to provide, to sanction, to grant, to declare, to restrict and repeal. Each term, when we talk about the purpose of legislation, holds a meaning. We are saying that legislations are such documents that are laying down your rights, your duties, and also your liberties and privileges that are available to you as a citizen of this nation, as well as they are also defining the powers, functions of the authorities that are liable or that are responsible for the working of the nation. Here, it is important to understand as to what are the importance of legislation. Talking about importance of legislation, there can be many importance of legislation. These are few points that have been jotted down for you people. Definitely, it can many other importance can also be added to the list. But to enumerate few, I have given you few points where we will discuss that as to what are the importance of legislation. When we talk about legislation, we say that they have abrogative power. What do we mean by abrogative power? We mean that old laws that are not apt to the existing needs of the society, they can be changed, they can be abrogated, they can be annulled with the process of repealing, amending, replacing the old laws. So when we talk about legislation, it holds the abrogative power to replace, to repeal, or to amend the old laws with the existing laws in order to meet the needs of the society. Second importance of legislation can be taken up as effectiveness. When we talk about laws, when we talk about laws, we say that there should be some effectiveness of these laws. And legislation brings this effectiveness by giving them a written form. Written laws are more effective than unwritten and oral ones. That laws are written down, we can easily find these laws and as well as the remedies that are associated with it. With this, we can refer to our third importance, that is definite. It means that it gives principles of law a definite form that are known before they are authorized. You can know where are your rights, what are your duties, and how you can avail these rights and duties, and what are your remedies in case these rights are infringed or you have not performed your duties. Fourth, it brings clarity. With the help of legislation, there is more clarity in the existing legal structure, which is to understand that one can know clearly what are the rights, what are the duties, what are the remedies that are available to a person. Written laws brings clarity as well as they are more definite in nature. Fifth importance is that is independent and emerges out as an authoritative source of law as they are laid down with proper procedure. Unlike precedents that are based on proving or disproving of a fact and arises out of a dispute, legislations are independent of disputes. It is not based on the disputes between the parties, but it is based on the fact that what laws are required for a welfare society. Sixth importance of legislation is that they are uniform. Legislation brings uniformity in the legislative system. With uniformity, we mean that there is a state or condition in which everything is regular, homogeneous, or it does not vary from situations to situation. But when we talk about importance of legislation, we also talk about what are the basic demerits of the term legislation. We can say that out of many demerits, there are mainly two main important demerits that can be related to the legislation. First one is inflexibility and rigidity. When we talk about rigidity, we say that statutes are extremely rigid and have little scope for selective application. This can cause injustice to parties in various cases. They are inflexible as it is not so easy to bend them or to change them, as one has to go through a proper procedure for changing the legislation. Whereas when we talk about precedents, these are the laws that are declared by the judges and they are more flexible, versatile, and adaptable. So here where the point of difference can be taken up between legislation and precedent. Another important demerit of legislation is that it leaves no scope of judicial discretion. To say, because of its inflexibility and rigidity, judges are made to apply the law as it is and they follow the laws as have been written down by the legislatures. The law is taken as it has been written down in the statutes. And as a result, it caused injustice to the parties because of other factors such as socio-economic and other circumstances are also to be considered while deciding the case by the judges. But when a law is written down, such conditions, such situations or aspects are normally ignored and thus lead to injustice. Whereas when we talk about precedents, they allow judges to give the decision on the merits of the case without being rigid and lay down the laws or declares the laws keeping in mind social, economic, and other circumstances. This is the second point of difference that can be taken up between legislation and precedent. There are other points of distinction between legislation and precedent, but that will be taken up later in the lectures. For today, we have taken up the concept of legislation, what we understand by the term legislation, how it has been defined by different scholars, what is the purpose of legislation, what is its importance, demerits, and from where the legislation had derived their validity when we talk about Indian Constitution. Next, we shall take up what are the kinds of legislation and what do we understand by delegated legislation. And thereafter, we shall also take up in detail as to what is the distinction between legislation and precedent. For now, this is what is required for the lecture. Thank you very much to all my dear students. Have a nice day.